brief introduction is I mentioned that I wanted to share two important caveats tonight. So in short, one of my friends and colleagues mentioned that one of the challenges with studying other religions within Jewish law is that in order to make any rulings on Jewish law, you have to come up with a definitive definition. But that definition is not being made by going to a Buddhist scholar and saying, can you define, you as a Buddhist, not even a scholar, a Buddhist, what is your religion? Then we can have a discussion about it and see how it might work within Jewish law. Rather, rabbis sit down and look at often the superficial nature of another religion and say, does this fit into our category of idolatry or not? Now, that is an important tool. And one of the things we'll explore tonight is that superficial ruling might be the foundational to the way the law is developed, meaning it doesn't matter what a Buddhist scholar says about Buddhism, it matters what it looks like. So that's the other, or I'll save the other caveat for later, but that's kind of the important thing going in is I am going to be talking about Buddhism tonight, and it will be a very, again, superficial definition. And I do not mean to offend or to shortchange in a very important world tradition, which certainly has a lot of value to add to the world. But our question tonight, is it possible for a Jew to both adhere to the traditions of Buddhism, or at least to integrate some of them, and to adhere fully to a classical understanding of Jewish law? And what we'll do is we'll start in looking at some of those laws, some of those definitions that are important for exploring whether or not we can participate, engage with another religion. So Deborah, I'm going to unmute you. This first source here, a little bit of background, is according to Rambam. His understanding of religion, which may or may not be true, but it's a very interesting one, is he goes back to the days of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve actually had three sons, the famous two, Cain and Abel, Cain Behevel, but they had a third son that the Torah mentions, Shet or Shase, or Seth in English. And Seth himself, or Shet, had a son named Enosh. And what Maimonides believes is if you go back to the earliest, and we're putting aside how old the earth is it 6,000, is it millions, is it billions, regardless, at some early point in human history, according to Maimonides, mankind, certainly based on the story of Adam and Eve, knew of God. They knew of the one God. They had full awareness of it. If they were worshiping or any kind of gratitude, it would be to God, no question. Now, at some point, they didn't forget about God, but they said, I want to worship God by giving thanks to God's creations. This tree was created by God, so I'm going to bow to this tree in honor of God. And then over a couple generations, you keep bowing to the tree, but what do you start forgetting about? God. So according to Maimonides, and again, whether or not this is historically accurate, it's just the background to this ruling, but he believes that ultimately all mankind originally knew of and believed in the one true God, and they went astray, and all other religious traditions are essentially, if you like boil them all back to their roots, they all start with the idea of one God, and they kind of go out from there. And people, it's not that they don't believe in God, it's that they're worshiping God's servants, and sort of forgetting that they all come from God. But the important thing here is in his second chapter of his Laws of Foreign Worship, he talks about the possible distinctions between a religion which believes in God, but does it in a peculiar way. They believe in God, but they believe that God, the one true God of the universe, you can make a statue of that God, versus a religion that believes in many different gods and that there's not just one God. So is there a distinction between a religion that does weird practices that look idolatrous, but they believe in one God, versus a religion that actually believes in many gods and is straight up worshiping idols? So Deborah, go ahead, source number one.
The essence of the commandment forbidding the worship of false gods is not to serve any of the creations, not an angel, a sphere, or a star, none of the four fundamental elements, nor any entity created from them. Even if the person worshiping knows that Adonai is the true God and serves the creation in the manner in which Enosh and the people of his generation worshiped the stars originally, he is considered to be an idol worshiper.
Excellent, thank you. So this is very important. Rambam starts out and he talks about people worshiping things that aren't God, worshiping the sun, worshiping the moon, worshiping rocks. Now, that's certainly idolatry. But then he has an important addition. He says, but even if people believe that their form of worship is towards the one true God, but it looks like idol worship, in practice, they have statues. They're making offerings to those statues, even though they say, ultimately, we believe in one God, but their practices are like that of idolaters. For all intents and purposes, we would call that idolatry. Now, we're not going to go into all of the practicalities of why does that matter. There's all kinds of laws about doing business with idolaters, certainly copying their practices, etc., like that. One very important practical thing is if somebody says they're learning they're learning physics. Physics has nothing to do with religion whatsoever, nothing to do with God whatsoever. So anybody, there's no idolatrous component. It's nothing to do with God. There's no idolatrous component to physics. Any Jew can learn physics. But if there's a religion that actually worships idols, then I can have nothing to do with that. In fact, I should actively reject it. But then the third thing is a religion that does believe in the one true God, but their practices appear to be idolatrous. The question is, how much can I engage with that religion? And according to Rambam, we really can't, and we treat them like idolaters. So I'll pause there for a moment and share my second caveat, which I already forgot. So once I remember my next caveat, I'll come back to it. But the source number 2 here, which Ken, I'll unmute for you, is now, let's say there is a religion, whether it's idolatrous or not, but they do something. They have some sort of practice, some sort of ritual. And I say that I don't want to worship their gods, or they believe in one God, but they look idolatrous, but they do something cool. They have some sort of meditative practice, and I want to emulate that. And again, as opposed to something like physics or painting, where there's no idolatrous component, there's nothing religious about whatsoever. What about rituals that are associated with another religion? When can I emulate or copy those rituals? And that leads to a very important second rule that will apply tonight, going back to a mitzvah in the Torah that specifically says you should not follow their chukotehem, their statutes, or their idolatrous practices. So in practical law, what does that mean? What am I not allowed to practice? Go ahead, Ken, source number 2.
We forbid those practices done as Gentile custom or law with no reason, where one suspects that it is an idolatrous practice or that there is a taint of idolatrous origins. However, those customs which are practiced for a reason, such as the physician who wears a special garment to identify him as a doctor, can be done. The same is true for any custom done out of honor or any other reason that is permissible.
Excellent, thank you. So if I go to India and I meet with a Hindi and they say that they're wearing a certain kind of garment because it's the way they worship Ganesha, then I say, oh, I want to wear that garment for fun because it'll make me feel powerful. That would be problematic. But if I go to someone from Hinduism and I say, what are you doing? And they say, I'm filtering my water to get out impurities so there's not a lot of arsenic in the water. And they develop that tradition about pure water because of some religious thing, but there's also a practical aspect of it, then it's totally fine. Even though they may have done it connected to their religion, because it's a totally legitimate, logical, reasonable thing, push-ups. If a rabbi once said to me, if somebody in a religion teaches you about push-ups, you say, what are you doing? And they say, I am pushing the earth away from myself as a form of worship to my God. And then you say to a doctor, and a doctor says, no, push-ups are really good for your health, then push-ups could be fine. So if there's a practice from a religion, idolatrous or not, but it has totally legitimate value, either physically or mentally, and it's not an explicitly, if they're bowing down to an idol and there's no value to that other than them worshiping their God, you can't do that. But if they have some sort of meditative practice that has clear, express, proven medicinal psychological benefits, then it might be okay to emulate that practice. So knowing these two things here, a religion which may not believe in multiple gods, but looks like idolatry is considered idolatry. That's one. Whether or not it believes in multiple gods, but it looks idolatrous, it's a problem. And two, any other religion, whether it's idolatrous or not, if they have a practice that we want to emulate, that practice needs to have some basis outside of their religion. If it's completely, whether it's painting colors on their face or clicking bells, if there's no reason anyone would have done that except as part of their rituals, if that's the only reason they're doing it, we can't copy it. But if they're doing something that has clear, some sort of practical, objective benefit that someone would have discovered eventually, then it's probably fine. Those are the two principles we're going to deal with tonight and apply them to Buddhism. So before we go on, are there any questions just understanding these two principles? Again, when we define a religion as avodah zarah, as idolatry, essentially there's no distinction of what they believe in and what they do. Practically speaking, Jewish law looks at them the same if their practices appear to be idolatrous, again, with physical statues that they offer incense to. If they say, oh, it's not a god, it's representative, that's lovely, but that's still what we define as idolatry. There's no distinction there. And again, the second thing, if there are practices we do want to emulate from them, there needs to be some other practical beneficial basis. Any questions before we move on? Excellent. So the next thing I want to do is, I said, I am not equipped or qualified to give you a crash course in what Buddhism is. I did study it a little in university, but that was an intro course. But I do want to give us a little bit of background. So I found a lovely, very brief video that gives us a brief introduction. I just opened the video. Leon, if you can see it, thumbs up. If you can't see it, then I just have to reset and share screen. If no one can see it, okay. So I'm going to do this again then. I will open it up. Then I will share my screen again. Share sound, optimize for video clip. Okay. Now, Leon, do you see a video, like a screen in front of you? Excellent. All right, so I'm going to play this very brief video that'll give us a very general introduction to Buddhism, and kind of pay attention to what the narrator says about Buddhism in relation to the laws that we've seen before about what we consider idolatry in practice versus theology, like what they believe, and about what their practices might be based on.
Buddhism is one of the 5 largest religions in the world. I'm sure you've seen Buddhist monks in martial arts movies. You've heard of meditation retreats. You've seen those big fat Buddha statues at your aunt's house. But what is Buddhism, and what do Buddhists actually believe? That's what we're going to cover today. Buddhism follows the teachings of the Buddha, or the Awakened One. I won't go into the story of Siddhartha Gautama and his famous ascent from plain Jane prince making it rain in Nepal to his enlightenment under the famous Bodhi tree, but we will explore his teachings. I'm obviously not going to summarize an entire religion on a YouTube video, but the foundational teachings of Buddhism cover a few key things. All the teachings of the Buddha are aimed solely at liberating sentient beings from suffering, that with right action and with right mindset, we can end our suffering. The Buddhist teachings mainly revolve around human suffering and ways to end it. For example, the 4 Noble Truths are that life often, in fact almost always, involves suffering. The reason for this suffering is that we want things to be a certain way. The cure to this suffering is to rise above the desire. And the way to rise above this desire is to follow the Noble Eightfold Path, practices which help us change our minds and understanding. Now that we're getting further down the rabbit hole, the Noble Eightfold Path is another one of the main Buddhist staples. That if we take right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, then we can begin to understand the 4 Noble Truths. We can understand our suffering and reach nirvana. Now, nirvana isn't just a famous band from the 90s. It's a supreme state of being in Buddhism. It means the complete letting go of desires and suffering. As we can see, the Buddhists believe most of the problems in the world are due to suffering, and a lot of our suffering is caused by our desires. Buddhist practices are focused on removing our desires and living in the present moment. The one who has conquered himself is a far greater hero than he who has defeated 1,000 times 1,000 men. This has been a brief summary of Buddhism and what the Buddhists believe. Buddhists do not believe that people should look to gods to save them or bring them enlightenment. Rather, individuals should work out their own path the best they can. It's a religion or a philosophy that focuses on helping yourself, being kind and helping others, and removing your desires to achieve spiritual happiness. Buddhism is one of my favorite religions and has spread through the world with its practical applications in everyday life. Was this video helpful? Would you like to hear more about the middle way?
Excellent, thank you. So now I'm going to go ahead and share the other sources again. Now, a few important things about that video. As you heard what some of the values, some of the goals that Buddhism has, first of all, you might have said, oh, I'd like that. I'd like to not be so reliant on physical things, because if I lose money, I'm sad. If I gain money, I'm sad. But if I don't care about money anymore, There's not so many things to make me sad. So this world is not so important. And that value seems like it could be consistent with Judaism. A lot of those values are, and we'll actually look at some more of the Buddhist values and see how they often do line up with Jewish values. Another very important thing is the only time it mentioned God is to say that the entire path of Buddhism has nothing to do with God. It is not a revealed tradition. Usually when people think of religion, we often think of God, a God or a God or gods who revealed some truth to the people and said, this is the way you should live your life, either to worship me or because I love you and I want to give you a gift. This is something that human beings discovered on their own. This man, Siddhartha Gautama, who there's a lot of books about him. There's actually a very interesting semi-fictionalized account by the author Hermann Hesse, who talks about his journey. But in his journey, he came to these discoveries on his own. This is a discovery all of you can have. And as we'll kind of come back to later, we have men like this in Judaism and perhaps women as well, who have just made some discoveries and said, I finally understand everything. But there's some very key important caveats that we'll come back to, which is that in this place, you want to get rid of suffering. So you want to get rid of all material things whatsoever and make, what's important is just being one with the universe, except for us. What's really important above all is not just getting rid of materialism, it's replacing it with God. Just because Buddhism totally rejects God or any gods whatsoever doesn't mean it's automatically okay with Judaism, because Judaism is religion of God. Judaism makes the most important thing of all, our connection with God. So a philosophy that says that you don't need God may not be idolatry, but may be problematic for other reasons. So I see Rifki had her hand up, so I'll give her a chance to ask her question and then we'll go on from there. Yeah, Rifki, you just got to unmute on your side. Yeah, well, go ahead, Rifki.
Part of the screen is grayed out.
That's okay. That's just where I have the boxes so I can see all of your lovely faces. But it should only be covering the Hebrew right now. I see it was probably covering some of the video.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that, but hopefully you got the gist.
I was just trying to figure it out.
No worries. I wish Zoom, maybe I should look up and see if Zoom fixed that. But now that we've got an idea of Buddhism, and again, one of the key things here is we've seen that they really don't believe God, a God is not at the core, either the one true God that we believe in, or multiple gods, that's not at the core of it. Now, there's a very important thing here about the history of Buddhism. It's a beautiful philosophy. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about it, especially at the end, except that when you have a beautiful philosophy, it is often adopted and adapted to any culture. For example, Maimonides, one of the greatest Jews in history, adopted and adapted Aristotelianism, a Greek philosophy from straight up idolaters, from classical pagans, but he made it Jewish. So Buddhism, and this is actually the caveat I kept forgetting, most of the tradition about how Jews interact with other religions and the conversations about what is and is not idolatry are usually around Islam and Christianity. Why? Because they are not only very close to us, but they have also been the religions close to us theologically and historically with shared origins. We've also lived amongst them and dealt with them for generations. And despite some claims by a few historians that Jews may have been aware of Buddhist philosophy and it may have influenced them at some point, for the most part, Jews were really not exposed to Buddhism. So there's not a lot of classical rabbinic texts explaining how Buddhism should relate to Judaism, what it should look like. A lot of these conversations are very new. You cannot find a single comprehensive, here is exactly how Judaism has viewed Buddhism over the generations. But going back to the idea of Buddhism being a general philosophy that any culture can adopt and adapt, the cultures that did embrace it were often idolatrous. So for example, Shintoism, I believe in Japan, is a version of Buddhism that adopts those beautiful ideas of releasing suffering, separating oneself from the world, and realizing what is truly important to end suffering, is also a religion that is suffused with demons and spirits and gods. So Shinto Buddhism is classic idolatry and deeply problematic. But there are versions of Buddhism that do not embrace other gods. It really depends. Buddhism has spread it's the fourth largest religion and huge in Asia. So the question of whether Buddhists are idolatrous depends on what religion they had before, where they are in the world. So it's impossible to just say, is Buddhism idolatry? You have to look at a specific region, a specific people, and say, is the way that this people practices Buddhism, is that idolatrous? And the reality is that in most cases, while they may or may not adhere to idea of multiple gods, in practice, many Buddhists, if not the majority, certainly a significant number of them, the way that they practice Buddhism often includes things like statues of a human being Buddha that they burn incense to. Now, they may be worshiping them no more than when I see a poster of the Beatles and be like, they're the best band ever. Not worshiping them, I just think they're awesome and their music is great. But I don't consider them to be deities. And nobody who hears me listening to Beatles music would think that I worship them. But even somebody who knows Buddhism, they see somebody with a statue of Buddha burning incense to it, it looks idolatrous. So again, one of the reasons saying, is Buddhism idolatry or avodah the strange foreign worship, is really difficult, is because again, sometimes it is, depending on who embraces it, and many of its practices just look like it. Again, even if they see the Buddha just as a man that inspires him, as an enlightened man that anyone can achieve to, if you have a statue of a man and you're bowing to it or offering offerings to it or burning incense around it, that's basically what the rabbis call avodah zarah, idolatry. And in practice, we had a class a while back on art, etc., like that, and talking about making statues. It doesn't matter whether or not you want to worship it. The Torah just said, don't make statues. So the Torah, God is concerned not just with people actually worshiping other gods, but doing the practices that look like idolatry. And that actually comes out in a really interesting way in these next two sources, hearkening back to our class on art and idolatry. And this is specifically on the question of the Buddha. Somebody who has a Buddhist statue, can a Jew own a Buddhist statue? Because that's one of the most common issues that rabbis see with Buddhism is statues. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So these two rabbis, 18th and 19th century, both talk about not making, because the Torah is clear. Rabbis, no Jew can ever make a statue of a Buddha, because that would be making a graven image. What about just owning a Buddhist statue? Again, I don't believe it's God. Now, Rambam said it doesn't matter what you believe. It looks like idolatry. But later in history, the rabbis got a little bit more lenient about having statues. Like if I wanted a statue of the Mona Lisa, is there, I mean, I know she's a painting, so whatever, some sort of statue, is that okay? So go ahead, Jane, source number 3. And this is before the Mishnah Brura. This is probably one of the most important commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch for Ashkenazi Jews.
Move the gray so I can see the Hebrew as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Let me just try that again. All right, go for it, Jane.
Okay. It seems to me that today it is permitted to own an object in the form of a man, since the issue with ownership is only a concern that one is worshiping the item, and it is known today that the form of man is not worshipped.
But there's a very important caveat there that comes up just a century or so later in this work, Darkei Tshuva, by the Munkacher Rebbe, Tzvi Shpira. Jane, you can take that as well in any case.
In any case, this, owning statues or something in the form of man, is specifically permitted when it is possible for an observer to assume that the object is for decoration or art.
Now, again, as we've seen and discussed, and it's really not difficult to learn to Wikipedia Buddhism and see very clearly that in their theology, their belief about the universe, that they do not have God at the core of it. Now, as I said, that may be problematic in other ways, because Judaism, by definition, has God at the core of it. But in terms of being an idolatrous religion, by their definition, they do not believe in other gods. There's no God at all that is a part of their religion. However, because Buddhism, A, the way it's been adopted by certain peoples, and B, the way it appears, many people are not, don't read Wikipedia, and many people look at it. In fact, in the Wikipedia article, it says that many of their practices include rituals, bowing down, making offerings to Buddha statues. They say it's not idolatry, they're not worshiping them, but like it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and talks like a duck, etc. So these leniencies here that might apply to something like Buddhism and Buddhist statues and their practices in general, it's kind of hard to apply them. But you see how this is not a black and white issue. It's very easy to see that Buddhism is not fundamentally idolatrous, but it's so complex complicated in the way it's been evolved, adapted, and embraced, it often looks like idolatry. It often can be idolatry. And the reality is this: when one walks into someone's house and they see Buddha statues, they don't automatically assume that it's a totally secular statue that's brought there to inspire them to become an enlightened person, especially if that Buddha statue has incense or other kinds of food offerings around it. So this leniency is very not impossible, but difficult to apply to Buddhism. And the next ruling here, let's see, Leon, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for this next one. It's also very important. And again, the context of this is Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin. He passed away just a few years ago. And he, not only a brilliant guy, was probably one of the few ever truly modern Orthodox poskim, meaning rabbis who ruled on Jewish law in the last generation. This ruling is specifically about going into different churches, but I think we can easily apply it to a Buddhist temple. So from his collection of Chuvot B'nai Vanim, go ahead, Leon, please.
The root of idolatry is the physicality of God. And all this, the emphasis on images and idols, exists in Catholic and Orthodox and Anglican Christianity. But since Luther, Protestant churches have abandoned the prostration to images. And in their case, even the image of Jesus on the cross is not an idol. Nevertheless, most Protestant churches believe in the Trinity and perform the Mass. And since they accept Jesus upon themselves as a God, it is forbidden to enter into their churches. And only the Unitarians and a few other denominations do not believe in the divinity of Jesus. And their churches are not houses of idolatry. And it is permitted to enter into them, not during their time of worship, just as it is permitted to enter into a mosque. Nevertheless, one should not do such because of suspicion, because people do not distinguish between one type of church and another.
Excellent, Leon. So the first part of this, again, is a whole other conversation about how we relate to Christianity in general. And essentially, the background of that conversation is that many rabbis hold that Christianity does believe in the one true God of the Torah. That is certainly their common origin. However, the way that they worship that God through Jesus, the idea of the Trinity and physical symbols, is forbidden to Jews. And practically speaking, can we enter into their churches? Well, is there anything in there that looks idolatrous? And he says in some of their churches, yes, but this is really important. He's saying here, they are not idolaters, but what they're doing looks like idolatry. But then he continues on and he talks about these other forms of religions, Unitarians, et cetera, which may not even consider themselves to be Christian, depending on what you ask them. But essentially, they don't have this iconography. They don't have all this symbolism. So there's nothing that even smacks of idolatrous images. And even though they believe in Jesus, ultimately they're not idolatrous because they still believe in the one true God, just in their own unique way. But why can't we just go into their churches, just go into their churches? Because someone might think that a Jew walking into their church might be joining their religion. So there's a lot of interesting things here to unpack, but what's really important for us is this. If you look through the majority of literature on whether or not rabbis today consider Buddhism to be idolatry, you'll hear something similar to what I said. Shinto Buddhism is idolatry because they believe their version of Buddhism has a lot of gods. But Buddhism at its core is not an idolatrous religion. However, it A, has the trappings of idolatry, and B, why can't a Jew just engage in all their practices and be a Buddhist the way that a Jew could take on karate? No one would say that karate is idolatrous. We'll actually come back to that in an indirect way. But why can't a Jew just take on Buddhist philosophies the way a Jew might take on poetry or just meditation in general? Because if one does it in the context of Buddhism, there is a concern or a suspicion. It appears that they are being part of the Buddhist religion, which we practically rule is idolatry, and a Jew is not allowed to do it. So again, there is an important distinction. Almost no one considers Buddhism in its general form to actually be idolatry, but it looks like it. So a Jew can't be a Buddhist. A Jew can't be a Buddhist, can't go into their temples, can't have Buddha statues around their house, but we don't call them actual idol worshipers. We just don't become. So if a Jew asks, can I also be a Buddhist at the same time I'm being a Jew? Every rabbi would essentially say, no, they cannot. However, we're generally not talking here about Orthodox Jews. The conversation about where these Jubus, and that phrase Jubu, short for Jewish Buddhist, became popular with the book, the Jew and the Lotus, or the Rabbi and the Lotus, which came out in 1994. And it was, this conversation about the relationship of Judaism and Buddhism, but it's something that's been going on really since the late 1800s, with the first ever Charles Strauss, I think, converted to Buddhism. And since then, actually, particularly after World War II, and that was one of the most painful, emotional, spiritual times for all of mankind. And people were looking for truth. They were looking for a different way. And that was reflected in music, in art, any of these things. You read in art history, what happens after World War II is a huge shift away from poetry. Everything, literature was a response to the horrors of World War II. And so too many Jews that felt not necessarily unfulfilled, but they felt alienated. They felt like Judaism could not respond to the horrors of World War II, particularly with the Holocaust. They were looking for a new truth. And Buddhism, which had slowly been gaining popularity in the States as a way to end violence, as a way to end suffering, became something that was a beautiful, popular alternative. So generally, these were Jews who were not observant. They were often secular, or they had some sort of background, and they didn't see it as abandoning their Judaism. Many did. Many full-on converted to Buddhism. They just left Judaism altogether. But many of them said, there's something that Judaism lacks. And World War II showed that all these Western religions, Christianity, Judaism, they are not able to respond to what's been happening in the world. But maybe the Eastern traditions are. So in the 60s, the beatnik generation, Jubu started to explode, and it's been going on for generations. And you can bet rabbis have been paying attention. Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi is a rabbi who started saying, whoa, you don't need to go to Buddhism. We have our own meditative tradition. So as long as Jews have been turning to Buddhism, rabbis have been saying, wait, we have meditation. We have all these practices within Judaism at home. We'll conclude with that. But what I want to do right now is, now that we've established the two rules, a religion, whether or not it's actually idolatrous, but it looks like it, is considered idolatrous, can't go into their churches, and we consider it a religion that you cannot adopt. Not like karate, not like art, things that are totally secular. You can't have anything to do with it, really. But if there are practices within that religion that you're saying, what if I just take, if I pick and choose practices from that religion, I don't become that religion. It is very clearly forbidden for a Jew to become a Buddhist. But what about some of their beautiful meditative practices? The answer is, it depends on the practice. And we're going to see right now two contemporary rulings reflecting everything we just talked about. So the first one is actually a ruling by multiple rabbis at a place called Machon HaTorah Va'aretz. This is an organization in Israel, and they deal with a lot of practical laws dealing with the land of Israel, things about agriculture, et cetera, like that. But their views are incredibly well researched. I wouldn't say they're modern per se, but they're not like crazy right-wing, cut off from the world. They're very much trying to be engaged in the world, practical rulings that can be used by observant Jews in Israel and elsewhere. So someone asked them the question, can I go into Thailand and enter into here? Arlette, I will go ahead and unmute you. And if you'll go ahead and read this short ruling from the rabbis of Machon HaTorah Va'aretz. It doesn't say who the rabbis are, but it's an institutional ruling. Please.
Okay. It is permitted to
It's a question. Is it permitted?
Is it? Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm looking at the Hebrew. Sorry. Is it permitted to enter? Are you able to hear me?
Yep, you're great. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a speaker. Is it permitted to enter into a Buddhist temple in Thailand? There is a prohibition to enter into a house of worship which practices Avodah Zarah, and all benefit from Avodah Zarah is forbidden. And in Buddhism, there is this prohibition because of Avodah Zarah.
Excellent, thank you. So one of the key things here is they don't really, they use that word Avodah Zarah, which practically means strange worship. Now, again, a lot of conversations talk about, is there a distinction between believing in one God and worshiping the one true God in a peculiar way through statues, essentially Christianity and Catholicism, versus a religion that actually worships other gods altogether, like the Roman religion believing in Zeus, or other religions believing in Thor and things like that. But here they're not making a distinction. Practically speaking, the things that happen in a Buddhist temple, statues, even if there are people that are not considered gods, although again, if you really dig in to Japanese mythology and stuff like that, many of the Buddhas become gods. It depends on who is practicing the Buddhism. Their local culture will affect and influence and paint that Buddhism. But here again, the rabbis say it's not about whether they worship other gods. Their practices look like idolatry. Therefore, one cannot enter into a Buddhist temple no more than they could enter into a Greek temple that worships Zeus. And same thing with a Catholic temple. A Catholic, I am saying here explicitly, Catholics are not idolaters. The practices that they do are forbidden by Judaism to Jews, and we would consider them, the practices themselves, to be problematic and certainly avodah zarah, but they don't worship multiple gods. We still can't enter into their houses of worship. And one of the biggest issues is because if we did, people would think, oh, we're doing those forbidden practices. That's one of the issues with Buddhism. But what about, again, the practices themselves? And now we look at the chief rabbi of Tzfat, and someone asked him about Tai Chi. Now, Tai Chi does not have a totally clear origin. It has roots both in Buddhism and other cultures as well, but it definitely has a significant tie to Buddhist monks as a form of martial arts. And it's not a martial arts that's so much about beating up the other guy or defense. It's about kind of, creating sort of energy flow and a sort of exercise and creating calm. So it's not a violent martial art, but it's a beautiful one. And in fact, as we see here, Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Gloria, source number 7, the Mayo Clinic has this to say about this martial art Tai Chi.
Tai Chi helps reduce stress and anxiety, and it also helps increase flexibility and balance.
Excellent, thank you. So Tai Chi definitely has direct health benefits, but it is absolutely connected to Buddhism. And anyone who sees it would know that it is connected to a religion, which so far we have said is practically speaking, I see the hands up, we'll get that in a moment. Practically speaking, Buddhism is considered avodah zarah, and Tai Chi, as opposed to just going to the gym and doing Pilates, or even yoga, which has kind of been separated from its religion, Tai Chi is definitely connected to that tradition. But the chief rabbi of Tzfat, Gloria, you can take this as well, and then I'll turn it over to Leonard. How does the chief rabbi of Tzfat rule on Tai Chi? Source number 8, please.
It is permitted to practice Tai Chi. When learning the art of Tai Chi, one should do it in private with an appropriate teacher.
Now, this is very interesting, though. When he says to do it betzniut, it's kind of hidden away. Is he saying that because he's like I recognize the benefit of it and how it's a positive thing, but it also kind of looks a little idolatrous. So don't have a shul event of Tai Chi. You can have a Pilates class or a Peloton class, but don't have a Tai Chi class at your home. But privately, you want to do it with a God-fearing teacher, like a man with a man, woman with woman, make sure everything's kosher there. There's nothing really wrong with Tai Chi in and of itself because it is independently a healthy, safe thing. And while we consider Buddhism to be idolatrous, some of the practices of it certainly have nothing to do with it. So I want to take those questions before we go to our final source. So Susan, go ahead. Just got to unmute on your side. And yeah, go ahead, Susan, please.
Tai Chi is not a Buddhist thing, it's Taoist. Taoism,
So
it's
if
another
it is
religion.
claimed to be connected to both Buddhism and Taoism. And in fact, if it is connected to Taoism, Taoism is much more clearly idolatrous, so make it more problematic. So in the research that I've done, and I can send you the articles I read, it said that it's connected both to Buddhism and to Taoism. There's a little debate there. But regardless, this is a point that religions, which appear to be idolatrous and are considered to be idolatrous, regardless of how they would define themselves, if they have practices which are separate from other idolatry, it would be permitted. Now, again, this all goes to our final question: can you be a Jewish Buddhist? The simple answer to that question is no. But are there things within Buddhism that we can learn from and adopt into our practice? And the simple answer to that is yes. Okay, so our last source here isn't a source per se, but if you went to somebody who considered themselves a Jubu, whether they said they're 100% Jewish, but they adopted the Buddhist thing. Again, the way that I have Jewish friends who are as orthodox as can be, but they're black belts in karate, and no one would ever bat an eye and say that's inappropriate. So too, they feel that they can be Jews and adopt Buddhism the way that somebody can adopt, again, say, I'm a Jewish artist, I'm a Jewish musician. Nothing wrong with that. I'm a Jewish Buddhist. But there are Jews who indeed consider themselves to be of two religions. So the question here, what are some of those things that Jews see in Buddhism and the practices that they want to adopt? And are they problematic practices? And more importantly, do they need to go to Buddhism to find those? And that'll lead to a more meta conversation about how Judaism and rabbis, particularly outreach organizations like Chabad and others, have responded to this drive towards Jewish Buddhism. Because if it's Jews adopting Christianity, even though I said Christianity is not idolatry, that's a much more easy, you can't be Christian. Like, that's a totally other religion. Why would you go towards that? That would simply be abandoning our religion. And that's another conversation altogether. But towards Buddhism, they would say it has nothing to do with God. And they show me the sources and the history, and we're like, well, you're right, it's kind of a gray area, but why do you feel you need to adopt Buddhism? So a couple of things that people really, Jews, classically have said they like about Buddhism. One is, and this is in source 9, the first one is reincarnation. The idea that if somebody in their life messes up, they can come back and try it again. And in fact, there's intention behind that. God will send somebody back in a way, whether through a man becoming a woman or vice versa, to somehow allow them to make up for the mistakes they made in their previous life. So for Buddhists, they will get reincarnated again and again, and other religions have this, Hinduism as well. And the goal is to break free of that cycle of incarnation. But I might go through 1,000 of them, learning a little bit every time until I'm ready to break free from the cycle. And Judaism absolutely has that as well. Now that idea has evolved and developed later in Judaism, but the idea that as somebody in their life has not fulfilled their purpose, God will send someone back and not give them all the tools, but maybe just enough of a push they can figure out is in Judaism. So first of all, it's also a shared value. It's something that we can say, you are our brothers, and we value that, which is God gives us a second chance. Now, they may not say God, and that's an important thing, as I mentioned in one of these things, but one doesn't need to look to Buddhism for that. Meditation is probably the biggest thing. And pretty much in any article one reads on Jewish Booze, they'll say it's all about the meditation. And we know that meditation has direct psychological and real, not even like pseudoscience. It has real physical and mental benefits. Now, it depends a little bit on how it's done. It has to be done right. One has to commit to it. But 100% there's medical benefit and social benefit to meditation. Now, if someone says, well, Buddhism has a very long developed tradition of meditation, you bet it does. And again, so does Hinduism. But what about Judaism? It's a little bit trickier. And what you do see, again, is the Zalman Schachter Shlomi in the 60s, 70s, and until recent decades, trying to develop that. You also have Rav Aryeh Kaplan, who also passed away a number of years ago, and he wrote a book called Jewish Meditation. And what he essentially does is he kind of takes all of these different sources that are real Jewish sources and kind of pieces it together and to create a vision of what Jewish meditation would look like. But it's not a huge stretch, but it's a bit of a stretch. What he essentially does is he looks at the mystical Kabbalistic tradition of rabbis sitting alone and trying to have meditative visions in which they essentially commune with God the way that prophets did. And it really goes all the way back to the idea of how did prophets talk to God? The only prophet who would just go out outside the 7-Eleven and say, God, I have a question. And God would say, what's your question? Is Moses. No one else could do that. But all other prophets commune with God either in dreams or some other meditative vision. So there is an idea of us communing with something greater, of discovering secrets of the universe through meditation. And eventually that develops in the mystical tradition about trying to say, God, we don't have prophets anymore, but we want to connect with you. We want to know what you want from us. Are there still secrets we can gain about how to live our life, about how to understand the Torah that we can get through a meditative vision? It's beautiful, but that's not necessarily the same as Buddhist meditation. So what you see is that if you want to look in classical Jewish sources, you're not really going to find that kind of meditation. But a lot of those practices and ideas are simmering in the idea of the mystical tradition. And you have, again, contemporary rabbis saying, okay, we're not going to claim that we have 1,000-year-old meditative tradition, but we can easily create one within Judaism. And instead of you saying Om Mani Padme Om and like different things in different languages, you can recite the Shema over and over again, which is something that Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, one of my friends, went to his synagogue and they did that. So he says you can create those kind of meditative practices within Jewish sources. You don't need to be a Buddhist. You can come to me as the rabbi and say, Rabbi, I need more than Judaism offers. I need meditation. Well, we can work on that. The next thing that's real, again, a very important idea is the idea that there's justice in the world. Karma, you reap what you sow. The things you put into the world will come back and get you. Well, that's just midah keneged midah, which is measure for measure. Joseph's brothers threw him into a pit, and then they got put into slavery, and then we got put into slavery. Everything, not everything, but most things in the Torah, it comes back to bite you in the end. So I don't know if many Jews specifically adopt Buddhism because of that, but it's a practice that they really connect to. But we definitely have in Judaism. You don't need to go to Buddhism for the idea of karma, but a significant difference is measure for measure in the Torah is brought about by God. Karma is brought about by man. So again, there's nothing idolatrous about karma, but it's missing something very important. A Jewish Buddhist may not be an idol worshiper, but they might be turning away from God, which might be just as problematic. Now, again, who are we speaking to here? If I'm speaking to a secular Jew or an alienated Jew who they don't really believe in God, that's not going to connect with them. The idea is, what can we find in Judaism that will inspire them, rather than saying, you're turning from God, you monster. That's be counterintuitive. Another really important thing is Buddhism has some beautiful values about how to live a good life. They're opposed to murder, adultery, theft, bearing false witness explicitly, and also getting really drunk. Well, the first four of those are in the 10 Commandments, the Aseret Hadibrot. And while drunkenness in Judaism, according to Rabbi Dinan, it's the 11th of the 10 Commandments, but practically speaking, the rabbis have a kind of balanced view. Alcohol is permitted and can even be a tool for joy, but when it is abused, I'll talk a lot about this before Purim coming up very soon, when it's abused, it can be an evil. But again, if someone says Buddhism has this value system that is the key to peace, again, that's a thing where it says, well, have you actually read the Torah? There are problematic things in the Torah, no question. But in terms of a core set of values about not murdering and caring for others, Judaism has that. And again, this list could be 30 long, but these are some of the main things that attract many Jews to Buddhism, the idea of a bodhisattva. And this is a person, a human being who of their own cognition, of their own abilities and intelligence, can achieve this enlightenment. And through meditation, through study, through deep thought, whether it's under a tree or not, can understand the way the world and the universe works and say, I get it now. I have no reason to be hateful. I have no reason to be angry. I have no reason to do anything but love my fellow people. And not only that, importantly, the Bodhisattva says, I could just leave this world. I could just ascend to heaven right now like Eliyahu Hanavi or Moses. I could just leave this world like that. And instead they say, I got work here to do. I care about other people. I know that everything is an illusion, but I love this world. I love my neighbor. I'm going to stay. We absolutely have that. And in fact, I wrote here tzaddikim, the righteous ones, but in many ways, that's what the prophets are. These are men who discovered secrets of the universe through God, not through their own recognition, through God, but they said, I want to share this with man. But then later in the mystical Hasidic tradition, we have these great men who through the study of Torah say, I got it. I figured it out. But more importantly, it's not about me. It's about sharing it with others to help them live a better life. But again, their goal is to connect them to God. And once you realize God's role in this world, God's hand, as it were, behind everything, it takes away a lot of that fear and pain and doubt and suffering. So Buddhists have their bodhisattvas, and Jews have their righteous ones, their tzaddikim, and I would absolutely say tzadkani women as well, these Jews who can enlighten people and lead them on a better path. So you don't need to go to a Buddhist monk to ask for enlightenment. It is within our tradition. But this is the final thought that I'll share before I open it up to questions. The key important thing of this class, practically again, part A is, can a Jew be a Buddhist? And even though Buddhism is not idolatry, the answer is no. A Jew cannot be a Buddhist because it is still considered a foreign religion, which is forbidden to Jews, which has the trappings of idolatry. So a Jew cannot be a Buddhist and a Jew at the same time. They would be seen as an apostate, a heretical Jew. They're still a Jew, but they're doing something that's forbidden, like breaking Shabbat or eating treif. They cannot be a Buddhist. But are there things that Buddhism has to teach us that we can learn from and adopt and adapt their practices? Yes, they have things that we can absolutely learn from, be influenced and inspired by. But the real important takeaway is not to say, well, it's permitted to look at Buddhism and say, what can I learn from there? The real takeaway is for the leaders of Judaism to turn to our people and say, how are you doing? Are you being fulfilled? What else do you need? And if people are saying, I feel like I need yoga, I feel like I need this, are there other ways to find that in tradition? And if Tai Chi and making kosher Tai Chi is a way to do it, fine. But oftentimes our tradition has so much beauty in it, but we often end up focusing on the things that we assume everybody wants. Everybody just wants to hear about, halacha and stuff like that. Some people love that, but some people need more. And if we don't speak to those people, then the people who are on the fence might leave Judaism altogether. At best, I would say, being Jubus, they might be doing something that would be forbidden. And at worst, they'll completely leave the religion and convert out. So Buddhism is not evil, it's not idolatry, but it's another religion that Jews are not allowed to be. Has it discovered some beautiful secrets and truth that we can learn from? Absolutely. But again, the question is, why are we not doing that in Judaism? And there are rabbis like Rav Aryeh Kaplan, Rav Zalman Schachter Shlomi, and particularly the Chabad and outreach movements that have started to really work on that and say, we need to meet the needs of Jews in the streets without them having to turn to another religion.